My Lords, what a privilege and what a pleasure to follow two such outstanding maiden speeches, one from my former Euro colleague, Lord Mohammed of Tinsley, and one from my former college chaplain, Lord Biggar. Even 35 years ago, as an undergraduate and prey to the slight self-absorption that we have when we're teenagers, even then I was able to recognise the qualities that will so enrich our councils here. His humility, his intellectual curiosity, and above all, that generosity of spirit, that largeness of soul that makes him consider other arguments and other people on their own merits. Now, it wasn't obvious that he had such intellectual diversity and future controversy inside him. I remember when I first came across him, he kind of looked like any other scruffy academic. He read The Guardian, he had this little short beard, he dressed like every other academic, and I would have been surprised had you told me then that out of him was going to come this extraordinary ethical balance sheet of colonialism. And I think it surprised a lot of his colleagues. And because he brought to bear that empiricism and that calm curiosity, which should be valued above all in academic settings, it triggered, as sadly these things do in our rather deranged culture war, it triggered a very negative reaction. His book was initially denied a publisher, and then it was howled down by people who plainly hadn't read it because all he was doing was trying to be balanced in a way that I'm sure he will in all our debates here. And I think the way he does this, and the reason he can be so indifferent to public opinion, is because he has a genuine faith in something bigger than public opinion. And not everyone has the gift of religious faith, but all of us, I hope, can at least exercise the self-respect that allows us to be honest and true to ourselves in difficult times. My Lords, I want to begin by thanking very sincerely all of the former Secretaries of State for Education, not just for having been Secretaries of State, but on both sides for having presided over a rise in standards which up until recently would have been unimaginable. And that happened, I think, for reasons that were hinted at by Baroness Morris. It was the beginning of diversity and freedom in education that allowed people to pilot new ideas, to trial new schemes, and this raised standards across the board. And she's quite right to say it wasn't just in academies, it was something that was happening in maintained schools as well. I think one could make a case that this was the single greatest achievement of the last Labour government in terms of the impact it had on people's lives. And a measure of its merit is that the new government adopted it and claimed it as its own, and people talk about Cameron and Gove reforms when they were really reforms pioneered by some of the members opposite. And they worked. And we heard from my noble friend, the Earl of Effingham, at the beginning, a measure of how they worked, because the reforms in England drove English schools up. PISA and indeed all of the other measures, there are 2 or 3 international measures of academic success, but there was a control in that experiment, because in Scotland and in Wales there were not such reforms, and those schools more or less stayed where they were or slightly drifted down in those academic rankings. So I hope, applying a little bit of empiricism, we can all agree that these were successful reforms. And I think the ministers, from what they've been saying today and in previous debates, don't want to undo the successful parts of them. Now, there's one very specific thing that I then want to raise. And it was a point flagged up by my noble friend, the Lord Baker of Dorking, and it's the future of the 44 university technical colleges. These are the schools that are set up by local businesses and by universities to fill identified skills gaps. They have an extraordinary success rate by any definition. 86% of them are rated good or excellent by Ofsted. And there is demand for more of them. New ones are planned in Southampton and I think in Doncaster because there is local demand for them. What's not always appreciated is because these schools start typically with kids of 13 or 14, by a lot of the academic measures at that age, these kids are not at the top of their cohort. A lot of the secondary schools really fight to hang on to the kids who are going to push up their standards. And children who have perhaps not done well sitting in rows and having a classroom-based education suddenly come into their own. And what's really extraordinary about these schools is not that they turn out great engineers, which you'd kind of expect, but how much better these children then start performing in their English A-levels and the like, because they're responding to a different kind of teaching. They're being treated as if they were already in the workplace, divided into groups, set to do tasks, and they flourish. It's not for everyone, but they flourish. And this is the real point about the diversity that comes from the freedom to apply the curriculum flexibly or to derogate from parts of it. I think people sometimes have the idea that these technical schools are teaching lots of metalwork. I mean, yes, they do teach metalwork, but they're also teaching 3D printing, advanced electronics, procurement, logistics. And the only way that they can fit all of that into the school day is by not having as much of that day taken up with modern languages, history, music, and so on. There are plenty of other options for children who want a humanities-based education. And I do hope we can retain a measure of diversity. I was very encouraged to hear the Lord Blunkett say that we should be prepared to amend the bill to put these things beyond doubt, as has happened on the question of teachers' pay and some of the other scare stories about the bill. I was privileged once to spend a day at, it's not quite a UTC, but it's almost the same thing, the JCB Academy in Rochester. It's housed in one of Richard Arkwright's earliest mills. And the children, as they come in, walk past one of his turbines, which has now been repurposed to be a turbine once again. Arkwright and the other men who made the Industrial Revolution were not academic kids. Almost all of them dropped out of education in their early or mid-teens because they wanted to get into the workshop and start tinkering. Where, my lords, is the next Richard Arkwright or the next Matthew Bolton? For goodness sake, let's make sure that they are capable of getting the kind of education that will help them and will help our employers and our economy.
Yeah.